Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Udi, let's jump in real quick. So solitary confinement, can you please describe this? Because as I've had these conversations with friends and others, people often think that solitary confinement is a result of someone having done something wrong in prison. And why is solitary confinement so commonplace? Is it because prisoners are doing things wrong in prison?
Well, you know, we've seen as a nation a dramatic increase in the use and reliance on solitary over the last couple of decades. We don't have exact, reliable scientific data since we actually do a terrible job as a country tracking how many people we place in solitary, but there is consensus that its use has increased dramatically, particularly in response to overcrowding. And where prison officials are overwhelmed and their quick reaction is to send people to the hole. So we have examples from New Jersey, we have examples from around the country of people being sent to solitary for things like talking back. I'll give you a New Jersey example out of New Jersey State Prison in Trenton, where an inmate by the name of Sean Washington in 2013, he was a clerk at the library. And he wanted to leave the library to go bring some legal papers to one of the other inmates. Yet a corrections officer said, you cannot leave. And the facts here are a bit disputed, but the worst facts, the facts that the state claims, is that Mr. Washington then said, mother effer to the correction officer, don't tell me what to do. That's the worst facts. What was his punishment? 90 days in solitary confinement. That is a real example. Those are examples that we see all across the nation. You know,
so I'm just wondering, just for time. So we know that people are being sent to solitary for many different reasons.
Right.
Some of them have to do with administrative issues and the like. Does it work in terms of in somehow affecting the behavior of prison? Is this something that has any productive value in the Bureau of Prisons?
Well, I'm going to push back for a second on some language that you use, and
Please.
that is some people are sent to solitary for administrative reasons. That's a loaded term because the Bureau of Prisons and other prisons commonly call solitary administrative segregation.
Right.
And it sounds really harmless, but in effect, it is solitary. And people are sent there for really minor reasons. And some reasons are for protective custody, like I mentioned in my testimony. So for example, the LGBT community, which faces disproportionate harassment from other inmates in prisons, a lot of times they will be sent to involuntary protective custody to protect them from inmate violence, yet they're being punished. We see this happening all the time. In the Bureau of Prisons, for example, according to, you asked does it actually work? So recently there was an independent review that was released to the public in February of this year by CNA that looked at solitary practices in our federal prisons. And it looked to this question: does inmate behavior change following solitary? And their response was absolutely no.
I would just like to pause there. Can we have that report put into the record for this hearing?
Yeah, without objection.
And then I want to just also say that not only LGBT, lesbian and gay prisoners, but obviously transgender.
Transgender, absolutely. But let me actually say what the CNA report actually found, because it's very important. It looked at an inmate's disciplinary record 12 months before being sent into solitary and 12 months after coming out of solitary, and it found virtually no change whatsoever.
So let's get to the New York Times article you held up today, the consensus upon medical experts. What is the damage, the trauma, the effect on an individual to be in solitary confinement? You said a shockingly, often on average of 4 years. I've talked to numerous inmates who've experienced that length or more. What is the damage done to someone in general, and would you also include in that someone who already has a mental health challenge?
Well, first of all, when I think of this issue, and to use an example that's contemporary, I think of it similar to climate change, in the sense of there are certain people that just deny the science. Yet the scientific community, there's consensus. There's consensus about climate change, and there seems to be consensus also
Please
about
don't lose this committee by talking about climate change. Let's stick to the bipartisan consensus.
But what I mean is that there is consensus in the scientific community about the harms of solitary confinement. And there are really two kinds of harms. One is that it exacerbates pre-existing conditions. So mental illness that existed before is exacerbated and becomes worse. And secondly, it also produces mental illness and also physical physical illness, things like anxiety, depression, hypersensitivity to stimuli, bipolar disorder. There's ever been documentations of that. The list is long, and I'm happy to provide the committee with citations to every.
I think that would be helpful if
Great.
you would provide more citations.
We'll do that.
I'm going to switch. First of all, I just want to say both to Mr. Dillard and Ms. Kerman, it's extraordinary that you are here with your testimony about what the experience of actual people who've been behind bars. That's extraordinary. And Ms. Kerman, I'd like to just, in the little bit of time that I have left, just drill down on something that is often not talked about, but what's happening as a result of overcrowding. We saw this in Danbury when it was converted into a low security men's facility. You were close to your family, and I'm really wondering what impact does being in prison in close proximity to loved ones have on an inmate, and what impact would gender-specific programming have on a woman's ability to successfully reenter? If you could, in the 1 minute I have left, just hit on both of those issues really briefly.
Okay. Proximity to home, family, and community is overwhelmingly important for both men and women who are confined to prison or jail. The opportunity
And let's just be clear, the majority of women in prison have children, and the majority of imprisoned people, period, are the #1 breadwinners for the family before they're incarcerated.
Absolutely. The overwhelming number of women in prison are mothers, and most of those mothers are the mothers of minor children, kids under the age of 18, who experience sort of a seismic impact when their mothers are incarcerated, because a lot of those moms are single moms who have primary responsibility for their kids. So the opportunity to touch your children, for your children to be reassured that their mother or their parent is okay, is incredibly important both to parent and child. The opportunity to see your own parents or family members, to maintain ties to the community, broadly considered, to which you will almost inevitably return. Senator Johnson is absolutely correct. The vast majority of people who are in prison are coming home from prison. So those lifelines to the outside community are incredible. We can't overstate how important they are to public safety, to people's safe and successful return home to the community. Because when correctional systems, whether it's the BOP or otherwise, cut those lifelines by making visits very difficult, by placing people very, very far from their families, or by making prisons inaccessible in other ways, by making phone calls exorbitantly expensive, or by, many jails have no contact visits through glass, which is a huge disincentive to have a visit. Those lifelines are cut, and the person who is incarcerated is much less likely to have both the family support, the safe and stable housing, the access to networks which might help them gain employment, all of which are primary concerns for successful reentry. And that is true whether you're talking about men or whether you're talking about women. When we are talking about female prisoners, just very quickly and briefly, we know that the 3 things that drive women's involvement in crime and their incarceration are substance abuse, mental illness, and again, that overwhelming experience of violence, either sexual violence or physical violence. 80% or more women and girls in the system report that happening to them before they were incarcerated. So the problem with incarceration, prisons and jails are very harsh places by design, is that for prisoners who have experienced very significant trauma, like rape, childhood sexual abuse, domestic violence, many of the commonplace correctional practices are very reminiscent of some of those abuses. And so that creates a serious, serious challenge in terms of regular engagement with female prisoners, in terms of their rehabilitation, and in terms of their, again, ability to return home safely.
I'm in deference to my colleagues, I'm over time, but thank you for that substantive answer.
Absolutely. Thank you.